The weight of small steps. The morning frost that had clung to Audie Murphy's salvaged combat boots 3 months earlier now seemed like a distant memory as he crouched in yet another frozen foxhole in the Vosges mountains of eastern France. January 1945 had brought a bitter cold that made November's chill feel like a spring afternoon, and the snow-choked forests around their positions held a silence that felt more dangerous than any artillery barrage. Murphy flexed his toes inside the small boots that had once been the subject of so much ridicule. They still pinched, still left his ankles exposed to the elements, but they had carried him through more fights than he cared to count. The men who had once joked about them now watched those boots with something approaching reverence, as if they were talismans that might rub off some protection on the rest of the squad. Sergeant Williams crouched beside him, studying the road junction below through a pair of cracked binoculars. At the intersection, a knocked-out German tank destroyer sat at an angle, its hull blackened by fire, but its deck guns still intact and pointing toward their lines. The vehicle had been there for 2 days, ever since the last German probe had been driven back, and nobody had been eager to get close enough to examine it properly. "Intelligence says they're massing armor about 3 clicks north," Williams whispered, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "Word from battalion is, we hold this ridge no matter what comes up that road." Murphy nodded, but his attention was focused on the tank destroyer below. Something about its position bothered him, the way it sat perfectly placed to cover both approaches to the junction. Either the Germans had been very unlucky when they lost it, or very clever about where they chose to abandon it. The 3rd Infantry Division had been holding positions in these frozen forests for weeks now, trading ground back and forth with German units that seemed to appear and disappear like ghosts among the snow-heavy pines. Every patrol brought back reports of movement, voices in the darkness, the sound of tracked vehicles in the distance, but the enemy remained frustratingly elusive. Murphy's squad was down to 6 men after the last encounter, and he could see the exhaustion in their faces. Private Coleman, barely 19 and still flinching at every distant sound, kept checking and rechecking his rifle with shaking hands. Corporal Hansen, the same man who had stumbled that night in November, now moved with a pronounced limp that he tried to hide from the officers. The radio crackled to life in their foxhole, and Williams grabbed the handset. "Dog Company, this is Dog 3, over." The voice on the other end was tense, speaking in the clipped tones that meant bad news was coming. Williams listened for a moment, then set the handset down with a grim expression. "German armor moving up the valley road. Estimate company strength, maybe more. They'll hit the junction in about 30 minutes. He looked around at the scattered positions where the rest of their platoon was dug in along the ridge. "We're supposed to hold until reinforcements arrive." Murphy studied the terrain below with new urgency. The tank destroyer suddenly made perfect sense. It commanded the entire junction, and if the Germans could get to it, they could use its guns to sweep the American positions clean. But reaching it would mean leaving the relative safety of their foxholes and crossing 200 yards of open ground under observation. "How long until reinforcements?" Hansen asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be encouraging. "Battalion says maybe an hour, maybe 2. Depends on what the Krauts are doing in the other sectors." Williams shouldered his rifle and began checking his ammunition. "Could be longer if they're hitting the whole line." The sound of diesel engines began to echo off the valley walls, still distant but growing closer. Murphy felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came before action, the way his breathing became shallow and his hands started to move with automatic precision. He had learned to trust these physical warnings, the way his body prepared itself for what his mind hadn't yet fully accepted. Coleman was staring at the tank destroyer with wide eyes. What if they get to that thing first? Those guns could tear us apart up here. Murphy was wondering the same thing. The German vehicle was close enough that he could see the details of its camouflage paint, the way snow had drifted against its tracks. In his mind, he was already calculating distances, timing, the angles of approach that might keep a man alive long enough to matter. Orders are to hold the ridge, Williams repeated, but Murphy could hear the uncertainty in his voice. They all knew what holding meant when German armor came rolling up that road. It meant staying in their holes and hoping the enemy didn't think to check the abandoned tank destroyer. The diesel engines were getting closer now, and Murphy could hear the distinctive squeal of tank tracks on frozen ground. He looked down at his small boots, planted firmly in the icy dirt of the foxhole, and felt that strange clarity beginning to settle over him. It was the same feeling he had experienced that night in November, the sense that the forest itself was about to demand something from him that no manual had ever described. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The first German tank appeared around the bend in the valley road like a steel nightmare emerging from the morning mist. Murphy watched through Williams' binoculars as the massive vehicle ground forward, its tracks churning up frozen mud and snow. Behind it, he could make out the silhouettes of at least 3 more tanks, with infantry moving in the tree line alongside the road. "Jesus!" Hansen whispered from the next foxhole. "That's a lot more than company strength." The German formation moved with practiced efficiency, the lead tank pausing at intervals while infantry scouts checked the woods on either side. They knew Americans were in these hills, but they hadn't pinpointed the exact positions yet. Murphy could see the tank commander's head and shoulders protruding from the turret, scanning the ridgeline through his own binoculars. Williams was back on the radio, his voice urgent but controlled. "Dog 6, this is Dog 3. Enemy armor in sight. Estimate 4 tanks minimum, heavy infantry support. They're about 800 meters from the junction." The response was lost in a burst of static, and Williams shook the handset in frustration. "Damn radio's been cutting out all morning. Could be the cold, could be the Krauts jamming us." Murphy kept his eyes on the abandoned tank destroyer below. The German column would reach it in less than 10 minutes, and once they did, they would have a perfect fire position against the American foxholes. The vehicle's main gun could probably reach their positions on the ridge, and its machine guns would make any movement in daylight impossible. In the Vosges Mountains, January 1945 had taught them all that winter warfare was as much about endurance as firepower. The men in Murphy's squad had been living in frozen foxholes for weeks, surviving on cold rations and whatever warmth they could steal from small fires that had to be extinguished at the first sign of enemy activity. Their weapons were reliable, but the cold made everything harder. Ammunition that jammed, hands too numb to work properly, equipment that failed at critical moments. Coleman had started shivering, though whether from cold or fear was impossible to tell. Maybe they won't bother with the tank destroyer. Maybe they'll just push past it. "They'll bother," Murphy said quietly. He'd been watching the German formation, noting the way they moved, the deliberate pace that suggested they weren't in a hurry. "They know we're up here somewhere. That gun position is too good to pass up." The lead German tank had stopped about 500 meters from the junction, and Murphy could see infantry dismounting from the vehicles behind it. Through the binoculars, he watched as a German officer pointed toward the abandoned tank destroyer, then toward the American positions on the ridge. Even at this distance, the enemy's tactical thinking was easy to read. Williams tried the radio again, managing to raise battalion long enough to report their situation before the signal dissolved back into static. "Reinforcements are tied up in Sector 7, he told the squad. "Could be 3 hours before anyone reaches us." 3 hours. Murphy looked around at their positions, hastily dug foxholes connected by narrow communication trenches, positioned to cover the road but not designed to withstand a sustained assault by armor. The 3rd Infantry Division had been fighting in these mountains long enough to know that holding meant bleeding, and bleeding meant some men wouldn't see the reinforcements arrive. Hansen was checking his rifle again, a nervous habit that had developed since his injury in November. "What if we pulled back to the secondary line? Bought some time until help arrives?" "Orders are to hold," Williams repeated, but Murphy could see him doing the same calculations everyone else was. 6 men against 4 tanks and supporting infantry, with no heavy weapons except a single bazooka that Coleman had never fired in combat. The German tanks began moving again, spreading out as they approached the junction. The enemy infantry was advancing through the woods on both sides of the road, and Murphy could hear the occasional crack of branches as they worked their way forward. In a few minutes, they would be close enough to spot the American foxholes, and then the real shooting would start. Murphy found himself staring at the tank destroyer again, its blackened hull and intact guns. The vehicle sat at the perfect angle to command both approaches to the junction, but it also sat directly between the advancing Germans and the American positions. A man might reach it if he moved at exactly the right moment. A man might even be able to use its weapons if he knew what he was doing and if the ammunition hadn't been removed. The thought came to him with the same strange clarity he had felt 3 months earlier, running through the frozen forest toward German voices in the darkness. His small boots, still tight against his feet, seemed to grip the bottom of the foxhole with particular firmness, as if they understood something his conscious mind was still working through. "They're going to overrun us," Coleman said, his voice barely above a whisper. 6 men can't hold against that." Murphy looked at the young private, then at Williams, then back down at the tank destroyer. The German advance was methodical, professional, overwhelming. In 10 minutes, maybe 15, enemy infantry would be close enough to call in fire from their tanks. The American foxholes would become death traps, and the ridge would fall regardless of what orders said about holding, unless someone changed the tactical situation. Unless someone reached that tank destroyer first and turned its guns around. The German infantry had advanced to within 300 meters of the junction when Murphy made his decision. He didn't announce it, didn't ask for permission or discuss tactics with Williams. He simply checked his rifle one more time, looked down at his small boots planted in the frozen earth, and began to move. "Murphy, what the hell?" Williams started. But Murphy was already out of the foxhole, staying low as he worked his way along the communication trench toward the right flank of their position. The sound of his movement brought heads up in the other foxholes. Hansen stared at him with wide eyes, and Coleman started to say something before Williams cut him off with a sharp gesture. They all understood what Murphy was doing, even if none of them could quite believe it. Murphy had studied the terrain during the long hours of waiting, the way he always did before action. There was a shallow ravine that ran from the ridge down toward the road, masked by fallen trees and thick undergrowth. A man could follow it most of the way to the junction without being seen if he moved carefully and if the German infantry hadn't spread out far enough to cover it. The ravine was treacherous, filled with ice and hidden roots that could turn an ankle or send a man tumbling into view of the enemy. But Murphy's small boots found purchase where larger feet might have slipped, and his slight frame could move through spaces that would have stopped a bigger man. He had learned these advantages through months of fighting in the Vosges Mountains, where January 1945 had turned every advance into a test of endurance and improvisation. Above him, Williams was trying to raise battalion on the radio again, his voice urgent as he reported Murphy's movement toward the tank destroyer. The response was mostly static, but Murphy caught fragments of words. Negative, hold position. Not authorized, orders that were already irrelevant, given that he was halfway down the ridge and committed to a course of action that would either save the squad or get him killed. The German tanks had reached the junction and were deploying in a textbook formation, their main guns traversing to cover different sectors while their infantry spread out to clear the surrounding woods. Murphy could hear their voices now, calm and professional, the sound of soldiers who knew their business and weren't expecting serious resistance from a handful of Americans in the hills. He reached the bottom of the ravine and paused, studying the final approach to the tank destroyer. 50 yards of open ground, covered by at least 2 German machine gun positions. The enemy infantry hadn't reached the vehicle yet, but they would within minutes. If Murphy was going to move, it had to be now, while the Germans were still focused on organizing their assault, rather than watching for counterattacks. Murphy thought about the morning 3 months ago, when his small boots had carried him through terrain that had defeated larger, stronger men. He thought about the jokes that had stopped, the way his squadmates now watched him with a mixture of awe and unease. He thought about Coleman's terrified face and Hanson's injured leg, and the way Williams kept trying to raise reinforcements that might not arrive in time. The tank destroyer's main gun was pointed toward the German advance, but its machine guns could be traversed to cover the American positions on the ridge. If the enemy reached it first, they could use it to sweep the foxholes clean before their tanks even had to expose themselves to return fire. But if Murphy could reach it first, if the ammunition was still there, if the weapon still functioned after being abandoned for 2 days in the cold, he started running before his conscious mind finished the calculation. His boots found solid footing on the frozen ground, and he moved in the weaving pattern he had learned through bitter experience, never in a straight line, never predictable, using every scrap of cover the terrain offered. Behind him, he could hear shouting from the German positions as they spotted his movement, the sharp crack of rifle fire that sent bullets whistling past his head. The distance to the tank destroyer seemed to stretch forever, each step taking him further from any possibility of retreat. Murphy could hear Williams screaming something from the ridge, probably ordering him back, but the words were lost in the growing volume of enemy fire. A German machine gun opened up, its bullets chewing up the ground around his feet, and Murphy threw himself behind a fallen log just as the burst passed over his head. He was 30 yards from the tank destroyer now, close enough to see the details of its construction, the way snow had drifted against its tracks and accumulated in the angles of its armor. Close enough to see that its hatches were open, which might mean the crew had abandoned it in a hurry. Close enough to hope that they had left something useful behind. The German infantry was closing in from 3 sides, their voices sharp with urgency as they tried to coordinate their fire. Murphy could hear tank engines revving as the armor moved to better positions, and he knew that in another minute or 2, the enemy would have enough firepower concentrated to make his position untenable. He looked back up at the ridge where his squadmates were waiting, their faces visible as pale spots against the dark earth of their foxholes. Williams was still on the radio, probably trying to explain to battalion why one of his men was charging a tank destroyer instead of following orders. Coleman was gripping his rifle so tightly that Murphy could see the white of his knuckles even at this distance. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Murphy reached the tank destroyer just as the first German infantry squad rounded the bend in the road. He hauled himself up onto the vehicle's deck, his small boots finding purchase on the icy metal, and dropped through the commander's hatch into the interior. The space inside was cramped and reeked of diesel fuel and cordite, but it was exactly what he had hoped to find, abandoned in haste, with ammunition still racked along the walls. The main gun was a 76-meter piece, larger than anything Murphy had trained on, but the controls were similar enough to the American tank destroyers he had seen in action. More importantly, the coaxial machine gun was a standard MG-42, a weapon he had captured and used before during the long months of fighting in the Vosges Mountains. January 1945 had taught every frontline soldier to be flexible about equipment, to use whatever worked regardless of which side had manufactured it. German voices were shouting outside, close enough that Murphy could hear individual words. They had reached the tank destroyer and were trying to figure out what had happened to the American soldier they had been shooting at. Murphy could hear boots on the vehicle's hull as someone climbed up to investigate, and he knew he had perhaps 30 seconds before they discovered him. He found the machine gun's ammunition feed and checked the belt, more than enough rounds to matter if he could bring the weapon to bear before the Germans organized their assault. The gun's traverse mechanism was stiff from the cold, but it responded to pressure, swinging slowly toward the road where the enemy infantry was advancing. The first German soldier to look down through the commander's hatch died with a surprised expression on his face, Murphy's rifle speaking once at point-blank range before he dropped the weapon and grabbed the machine gun's handles. The MG-42 came alive in his hands, its distinctive buzzsaw sound echoing off the valley walls as he raked the road where the enemy squad was trying to take cover. The tactical situation changed in an instant. The German tanks, which had been moving forward confidently, suddenly found themselves taking fire from their own abandoned equipment. Murphy could hear their engines roaring as they tried to reposition, but the tank destroyer's location made it almost impossible for them to return fire without destroying their own vehicle. From his position inside the tank destroyer, Murphy had a perfect view of the entire junction. He could see German infantry scrambling for cover behind trees and rocks, could see their officers pointing and shouting orders that were barely audible over the sound of the machine gun. The enemy had been expecting to sweep aside a handful of Americans in foxholes, not to face concentrated fire from a prepared position. Williams and the rest of the squad opened up from the ridge, their rifles and the single bazooka adding to the chaos as the German advance stalled. Murphy could see muzzle flashes from the American positions, could hear Williams shouting encouragement that carried down the slope despite the noise of battle. But Murphy also knew that his position was temporary. The Germans would reorganize quickly, would bring up heavier weapons or find angles that would let their tanks engage the destroyer without approaching too close. He had perhaps 5 minutes before the tactical advantage shifted back to the enemy, 5 minutes to do as much damage as possible before the situation became untenable. He traversed the machine gun toward a German squad that was trying to work around the left flank. The weapon sustained fire, cutting down 2 men and sending the rest diving for cover. The gun was hot now, almost too hot to touch, but it continued to function with the mechanical reliability that had made it feared throughout the war. A German tank was maneuvering for a shot, its main gun swinging toward Murphy's position. He could see the barrel moving, could calculate the angle and timing, and he knew that when that gun fired, the tank destroyer would become his tomb. The armor might stop small arms fire, but it wouldn't stop a direct hit from a tank's main gun. Murphy thought about his squad on the ridge, about Coleman's terrified face and Hansen's limp, and Williams' desperate attempts to raise reinforcements on a radio that barely worked. He thought about the citation that would be written if he died here, the clean sentences that would describe his gallant action and supreme sacrifice, without mentioning the fear that made his hands shake, or the way diesel fumes made his eyes water. The German tank fired. The shell passed so close to the tank destroyer that Murphy felt the pressure wave, heard metal fragments ringing off the armor as the round detonated somewhere behind him. The enemy gunner had miscalculated, probably thrown off by the awkward angle and the reluctance to destroy his own equipment. But the next shot would be better aimed, and Murphy knew he was running out of time. He swung the machine gun toward the German infantry one more time, laying down a long burst that cleared the road and sent the survivors scrambling back toward their vehicles. Then he grabbed his rifle and began climbing out of the tank destroyer, his small boots slipping on the icy metal as enemy bullets began snapping past his head. The run back to the American lines was even more desperate than his advance had been. Murphy sprinted across the open ground while German fire erupted from multiple positions, his boots finding traction on terrain that seemed designed to kill him. He could hear Williams screaming his name from the ridge, could see Coleman standing up in his foxhole despite the bullets flying around him. 50 yards from the American positions, Murphy stumbled and went down hard, his rifle skittering across the frozen ground. For a moment he thought he had been hit, but it was just exhaustion and the accumulated stress of 30 minutes that had felt like hours. He forced himself back to his feet and completed the run to the ridge, diving into Williams' foxhole just as a German machine gun found his range. Murphy lay at the bottom of the foxhole, gasping for breath while Williams checked him for wounds. His small boots were scuffed and torn from the run across the rocky ground, and his hands were black with diesel fuel and cordite residue from the tank destroyer's machine gun. The sound of German tanks withdrawing echoed across the valley, but Murphy could barely hear it over the ringing in his ears. "You crazy son of a bitch," Williams said, but his voice carried relief rather than anger. "What the hell were you thinking?" Murphy couldn't answer immediately. His breathing was still ragged, and the adrenaline that had carried him through the last hour was beginning to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to seep into his very soul. He had done what needed to be done, had bought his squad the time they needed, but the cost was becoming clear in ways that would never make it into any official report. The truth that Murphy would never tell anyone, the secret that would haunt his sleep for decades afterward, was how natural it had felt to kill from inside that tank destroyer. The machine gun had seemed like an extension of his own will, each burst perfectly controlled, each target selected with a clarity that frightened him more than any enemy fire. For those few minutes, he had been exactly what the war wanted him to be: a perfect killing machine, efficient and remorseless. Coleman was staring at him with wide eyes, the same expression Murphy had seen on too many young faces during the long campaign in the Vosges Mountains. January 1945 had aged them all beyond their years, but some experiences carved deeper than others. Murphy could see himself reflected in Coleman's gaze, not the scared kid from Texas, but something harder and more dangerous. "How many?" Williams asked quietly. Murphy thought about the German soldiers who had fallen to the machine gun, the faces he had seen through the tank destroyer's vision blocks. 6, maybe 7. The machine gun got most of them before their tank started shooting back. It was an accurate count, delivered in the flat tone that frontline soldiers used when discussing such things. But Murphy didn't mention the way one of the Germans had tried to crawl away from the road, or how he had tracked the man's movement with the machine gun until he stopped moving. He didn't mention the young soldier who had called for his mother in the moments before Murphy fired, or how the sound had carried clearly through the tank destroyer's armor. Hansen was looking at the abandoned vehicle below, where smoke still rose from the engine compartment. "Think they'll try again?" "Not today," Williams said. "Maybe not at all if they think we've got more firepower than they planned for." He looked at Murphy with something approaching awe. "Battalion's going to want a full report on this. Hell, regiment probably will too." Murphy nodded, though the thought of explaining his actions to officers who hadn't been there made him feel tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. They would want to know about tactics and timing, about the technical details of operating captured equipment. They wouldn't want to hear about the moment when he realized that killing had become as natural as breathing, or the way his hands had moved across the machine gun's controls without conscious thought. The radio crackled to life, and Williams grabbed the handset. This time the signal was clear, and Murphy could hear the excitement in the battalion commander's voice as Williams reported the successful defense of the junction. Words like commendable initiative and extraordinary courage filtered through the static, the kind of language that would later appear in citations and commendations. But Murphy was thinking about the German tank commander he had seen through his binoculars, the way the man had studied the American positions with professional competence. That officer was probably writing his own report right now, explaining how a single American soldier had turned what should have been a simple advance into a tactical disaster. The German would use different words, but the basic facts would be the same. One man with a machine gun had changed the outcome of the engagement. Coleman was cleaning his rifle with shaking hands, the nervous energy that had carried him through the fight beginning to fade. "I don't know how you did it, Murphy. Running down there with all those tanks." Murphy looked at the young private, seeing something of his own earlier self in Coleman's frightened courage. "Sometimes you don't have a choice. Sometimes someone has to go." And it was the kind of simple statement that would be quoted in newspaper stories and repeated in barracks conversations, but Murphy knew it didn't capture the complexity of what had actually happened. The choice to leave the foxhole had been made by instinct rather than conscious decision, driven by a calculation that had more to do with survival than heroism. If the Germans had taken the tank destroyer, everyone on the ridge would have died. Going forward had been the logical option, not the brave one. Williams finished his radio conversation and turned back to the squad. "Reinforcements are finally moving up. Should be here within the hour." He paused, studying Murphy's expression. "They want to recommend you for something. Silver Star, maybe the Distinguished Service Cross." Murphy felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever medals were mentioned. Each citation was another weight to carry, another story that would be retold until it bore no resemblance to what had actually happened. The official version would focus on his courage and initiative, not on the way his hands had trembled as he climbed into the tank destroyer or the satisfaction he had felt watching German soldiers fall. The truth was that Murphy had stopped thinking of himself as a hero months ago. Heroes were what other people called soldiers, who survived when they should have died, who killed efficiently enough to protect the men around them. The citations and commendations were for the folks back home, who needed to believe that war produced heroes rather than simply survivors with steady hands and flexible consciences. The reinforcements arrived 3 hours later, fresh-faced soldiers from a reserve company who stared at the abandoned tank destroyer with the kind of fascination that Murphy recognized from his own early days in the Vosges Mountains. January 1945 had been an education in the difference between training and reality, between what the manual said about combat and what actually happened when good men tried to kill each other efficiently. Lieutenant Morrison, the reinforcement company commander, climbed up to inspect Murphy's squad positions with the methodical attention of an officer who would have to write a detailed report. He asked the right questions, took careful notes, and praised the squad's successful defense of the junction in language that would look impressive in official correspondence. "Textbook use of available resources," Morrison told Williams as they stood beside the tank destroyer. "Taking initiative to neutralize enemy assets shows exactly the kind of tactical flexibility we need at the squad level." Murphy listened to the conversation from his foxhole, where he was cleaning diesel fuel off his rifle and trying not to think about the metallic taste that had been in his mouth since the shooting stopped. The lieutenant's words would become part of the official record, joining the growing collection of commendations and citations that followed Murphy's name through the military bureaucracy. Williams walked back to the squad positions and sat down beside Murphy. "Morrison wants to interview you personally. Says division is putting together a story for the folks back home. Local boy makes good, that kind of thing." The prospect of being turned into a propaganda story made Murphy feel hollower than he had after the fighting. He thought about newspaper readers in Texas, learning about his heroic action over their morning coffee, parents telling their children about the brave soldier who had saved his friends. None of them would know about the way his hands had moved across the machine gun's controls, or the careful precision with which he had selected targets. Coleman was writing a letter to his mother, his handwriting shaky but determined. Every few sentences he would look up at Murphy, then back at his paper, trying to find words for what he had witnessed. Murphy knew that Coleman's letter would be one of dozens, each telling a slightly different version of the same story, each adding details that would eventually become accepted facts. "My squad leader says we were outnumbered 10-1. Coleman wrote, his voice barely audible as he read the words aloud to himself. But Murphy charged their whole company with just his rifle, captured one of their tanks, and drove them off. Already the story was changing, growing in the telling. Murphy hadn't charged a company. He had sprinted to a tank destroyer and used its machine gun for perhaps 10 minutes before retreating. He hadn't captured anything. He had simply used abandoned equipment. But Coleman's version would be the one his family remembered, and his family would tell their neighbors. And the truth would become something larger and more heroic with each retelling. Hansen was studying the terrain below with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to read ground through hard experience. You know what bothers me most? How easy it looked when you did it. Like you'd done the same thing 100 times before. Murphy thought about that assessment as he worked on his rifle. There was truth in what Hansen had observed. The movement to the tank destroyer had felt familiar, natural in a way that disturbed him more than any enemy fire. Somewhere during the long months of fighting, he had developed instincts that operated independent of conscious thought, reactions that prioritized efficiency over everything else. The medal ceremony came 2 weeks later, held in a village that had been liberated so recently that the rubble was still being cleared from the main street. Murphy stood at attention while a general whose name he immediately forgot pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to his uniform, speaking about courage and dedication in a voice that carried to the assembled troops and war correspondents. The photographers captured the moment for posterity, the young soldier from Texas receiving recognition for his extraordinary valor in the face of overwhelming odds. The images would appear in newspapers across America, visual proof that the war was producing heroes worthy of the sacrifice being asked of every family. But Murphy found himself thinking about the German soldiers who hadn't made it back to their own lines, about the reports their officers would file and the letters their families would receive. Those men had been doing their jobs with the same professional competence that Murphy brought to his, following orders and trying to protect their comrades. The war had simply placed them on opposite sides of a tank destroyer on a cold morning in January. Years later, when veterans gathered to share stories and compare memories, Murphy would listen to increasingly elaborate versions of what had happened at the road junction. He would hear about impossible odds overcome through pure courage, about single-handed charges against entire armored columns, about heroic sacrifices that saved countless American lives. He never corrected these stories. The men who told them needed heroes, needed to believe that the terrible things they had done and seen had been part of something larger and more meaningful than simple survival. Murphy understood that his role was to carry their need for meaning, to be the symbol that made sense of experiences that defied rational explanation. Sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, Murphy would remember the weight of his small boots on the tank destroyer's deck, the way they had gripped the icy metal as he dropped through the commander's hatch. He would remember the machine gun's recoil against his shoulder and the satisfaction he had felt watching his targets fall. These were the memories that no citation could capture, the truth that lived behind the legend. The boots themselves had finally been replaced by the time the war ended, traded for properly fitting equipment that carried him through the final advances into Germany. But Murphy kept them, wrapped in an old undershirt and stored in his duffel bag alongside letters from home and a few photographs of men who hadn't made it to the end. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.